A while ago, I came across the work of Christopher Thi Nguyen. His book on games lays out a compelling argument about how, as an art form, they work in the medium of agency. In games, we temporarily adopt certain values and goals, and this maps onto certain behaviors we adopt in real life outside of games. But there's a pretty clear danger here in that we might take the temporary values we've adopted and wear them a little bit more tightly than we should. So a relevant question becomes, how do you adopt certain pragmatic values when they're useful for you and not do so otherwise? Beyond that is a very hard series of questions, and I wanted to understand how Professor Nguyen thinks about them. I enjoyed hearing his perspectives, and I hope you'll learn something from them as well. This is the Gradient Podcast. I'm Daniel Bashir. The best way you can help me out with this project is by sharing it with people you know and by leaving ratings and feedback. And now, Christopher Thi Nguyen. I'd started noticing this when I first encountered your talking and writing, and I think in both cases you just kind of came out and said this eventually, but I was seeing James C. Scott like everywhere. And I think that in a lot of your talks and a lot of your writing, the name kind of comes up. And it's very interesting to me. You're probably tired of hearing his name by now, but I suppose what sticks out to me as interesting is just the way in which Seeing Like a State entered the consciousness of a lot of people who read it. And a lot of us really think with and through that book almost. And I'm kind of curious how you think about that effect on you, and then perhaps how or if that relates to kind of your ambitions with your own work as well.
Oh, that is a beautiful question. I mean, Seeing Like a State. So, should we explain the basic idea for the audience? Or
Sure.
So Seeing Like a State is one of these books that does have this kind of like transformative effect on a lot of people that read it, and it kind of takes a lot of things that you kind of background knew and then puts a simple, clear world-spanning narrative about it, around it, which is both like enrapturing and I've come to think also something we need to be a little bit suspicious of. It's amusingly a book about the over-seductiveness of clear, simple, simplified narratives, of which it provides a clear, simple, world-spanning narrative. But the basic idea of Seeing Like a State is that states, and by states, Scott says that states include governments, corporations, globalized capitalism. It's any kind of, I think, of centralized information processing structure, like an institution or a bureaucracy or linked to markets. And the view is something like states can only see the parts of the world that they can process through the kind of bureaucratic information processing style of a state. And I suspect we're going to talk a lot more about this, but briefly, this means things like you need metrics, quantification, and standardized categories. And what he ends up saying is that there are parts of the world that are much easier to process into standardized categories and metrics, and parts of the world that are much harder to process. So what he ends up saying is that certain things, the things that are easy to quantify, are legible to the state. And certain things that are harder to quantify and harder to standardize are illegible to the state. The state can't see into those parts of the world. So I think a simple example is something like, I don't know, if you're trying to monitor health, shifts in BMI or weight or shifts in mortality statistics are really legible to the state. Shifts in well-being, joy, happiness, satisfaction, those are really hard to measure for the state. And then he ends up saying that the state has a motive to transform the world to make it into terms that are more legible to it. So he has all these examples about like forestry management services going into these dense, hard to manage, hard to read forest ecosystems and replanting them into like even rows of the same kind of tree because that's easier to track data on. And one way to say what I've been doing, this is, I mean, you've kind of jumped to the end. This is like my surprise finale.
Yeah.
Scott really talks about this for externalities in the world. So he's interested in how states tend to reorganize labyrinthine streets into clear grids that are easier for the state to keep control of. How they change agriculture from complex polycropping systems that require high skill to these simple, standardized, legible monocropping systems where you have standardized soil acidity, right? All this stuff. I think a lot of my work is just extending that to the innards of people, right? That the state also wants to make our so the state wants to make our values legible to it. And what that looks like is what I'm going to call value capture, which is when we start caring not about the weird, janky shit we would naturally care about, but we align our interests with things, with clear metrics, with things that the state can already handle. So if you stop caring about, I don't know, wisdom and curiosity and just start caring about GPA or paper output, that's much more legible to the state. And so I really think of the stuff I'm doing as taking the Scott style view, which has been focused on externalities, and extending that to values.
And you see analogs of this literally everywhere. I don't know about you, but I think probably if you were to measuring the distribution of words that I use now versus 5 years ago, the word legibility has just like completely shot up. And it's solely because of that book. But I'm thinking about a lot of the ways in which this kind of comes across right now, and things we're wondering. One that is adjacent to the AI space is notions of ideas like progress studies that are really trying to aim at developing a science of this kind of notion we call progress, which is itself something that could be reasonably complicated and could be broken down into a bunch of things. But at least one person I know is concerned that progress is itself this simplified version of what it's really trying to aim at, which to him is something more like human flourishing. And I think that kind of maps onto some of the ways that you're thinking about this as well. But
Exactly. So I one of the things I want to say is like, so I'm sure we're going to get into a ton of this, but one of the things I just collect is these pairs of like what you might naturally care about and then what's easy to institutionally measure. So for example, in news, you might care about informational newsworthiness and understanding, but instead you might get interested in clicks and views, right? With Twitter, you might be interested in communication naturally, but then Twitter orients you towards something that's very easy to collect, which is likes, follows, and retweets. It gets deeper. I mean, those are simple toy examples. I've been struggling for a while. So uh, let me just put something on the table that I think will help listeners. So one of the things I've been working with is this concept I'm calling value capture. And value capture happens when your values are richer or subtler or in the process of developing towards something rich and subtle. And then you get put in an institutional setting. And that institutional setting gives you a simplified, typically quantified proxy version. And then that takes over. You start caring about that. Like for academics, that would be something like starting in caring about, I don't know, understanding truth, wisdom, and coming out caring about either your citation rates or the size of your grants, right? I think you see these. What I've started to find out is management studies is full of these examples where founders have some vision for a company that's actually really like, I'm going to make a richer user experience. I'm going to make tools that like help people like express themselves. And then within like 10 or 15 years, that becomes how many products do we ship and what is our profit margin? And even in like, I mean, I think it's really easy to talk about those cases when you have these like kind of nasty profit orientation cases, but you see cases like that easily in, I mean, in education, right? Like a lot of, even when you're not focused on something like profits, the kinds of things that are easy to measure in educational context are things like student graduation rates, student graduation rates, student graduation speed, student employment rates, student salaries, and the things that are really hard to measure are, you know, like curiosity, reflectiveness, like open-mindedness. So, I mean, sorry, so those pairs I'm super interested in, and the long-term tendency. Let me say, sorry, I've gotten thrown off my game a little bit because you've like jumped to the big interesting questions at the end of what I'm.
Sorry about that.
No. It's great. I've had this question for a really long time, and that question is, why do metrics seem to fuck up human values so much? Like what? So I worked in education learning outcomes assessment for a while, um, and there was no institutional outcomes metric any of us could find that we actually believed in. It just seemed to be institutionally legible crap. And I've had this question about why. You might just think that you could find the right metric. It'll just take some time. And I've been on this quest to figure out maybe there are reasons why that's not the case. So this is actually, in some sense, like a lot of the research I've been doing is trying to figure out the details of what Scott means by legibility. Like what exactly is legible to the state and what exactly is not legible to the state. So there's some interesting accounts. I'm kind of undecided about which ones are right. I'm kind of working on my own. But let me try you on Elizabeth Barnes' account. So Elizabeth Barnes is a philosopher and a metaphysicist, and her new book is Health Problems, and she has a really good argument towards the end about why you'll never get a good metric for well-being. And the idea is something like this. Some terms have a stable referent, and some terms have a context-sensitive referent. So a really easy example is large, right? Like large for a mouse, large for an elephant, large for a car. Context of deployment is going to change the meaning of the term. There's a subtler set of cases where the meaning of the term gets shifted depending on your interests or values. And so she ends up saying something like, she gives examples of like, you go into the doctor and you ask like, you say like, I want my knee to be healthy. How healthy is my knee? And she thinks the evaluation of that term depends on a specific interest you have about that knee. And those interests can vary from person to person. So some people might be interested in having their knee work for as long as possible. Other people might be interested in, an athlete might be interested in high performance for the next 10 years, not a long life cycle of the knee. Some people might be more interested in being pain-free. Other people might be more interested in preserving functionality. That is, say I'm a climber, the ability to climb for as long as possible, and are willing to trade off pain for it. Each of the term healthy, she thinks, is going to be the kind of thing that actually changes meaning with different interests. That's going to be extremely hard to capture as something like an objective metric because of the hidden interest relativity of the meaning of the term. Sorry, this is that I've like, you've pushed me straight into like wonky geeky philosophy side of this stuff. I'm not sure. Is that interesting? Is that tracking?
That's very interesting. I think this is another thing that's kind of that's interested me in a lot of places and a lot of the examples you bring up. And I know for me, I think the health thing is something I can definitely personally relate to, with having myself experienced what I would probably describe as value capture as well when it comes to these things.
Oh my God, can I give you one more example? I think this will be
please.
particularly interesting for people in the data space, because it's really, some of the philosophers of science here have gotten really grounded. So Jacob Stegenga is this really interesting philosopher of medicine. He has this book called Medical Nihilism, which is delightfully pessimistic.
What a name.
Yeah, the argument is basically it's not an anti-science argument. It's that by the standards of good science, contemporary medicine largely fails. There's a profit motive diagnostic, but he thinks that basically the standards of medical trials are shifted not to capture actual long-term effects on people, but to make it more likely that large pharmaceutical companies can get through. It's careful. It's not like goofball stuff. It's very careful. There's this incredible. He gives some meta studies where it turns out that there's a meta study looking at different meta studies about the efficacy of various pharmaceuticals, and it turns out the highest predictor of whether a meta study will say a medicine works or not is whether it's funded by pharmaceutical companies or not. So stuff like that. But he's this really interesting account. Sorry, that's just a sidebar. That's entertaining cynicism for me. But the thing that's really interesting is he's interested in. So the philosophers of science typically are interested in cases where something that appears as objective turns out to be value laden. This is going to, I'm sure, be something we talk about all of today. And he ends up talking about the notion of a disease. So he tries to figure out whether there's an objective value-free account of a disease, what it is to be a disease. And so for some examples, there are all these cases where something that was not once medicalized has now come to be treated to medicalized and treated as disease. So for example, obesity, he actually has a really interesting paper about the transition of low sex drive from just something that's part of your life or maybe a feature of how your life is going to something that gets treated as a disease and is medicalized. So the concept of disease fixes what we think doctors should be working on, right? When you transition playing too many games from just, I don't know, what you might think of as a fault of the will to a disease, an addiction, right? Then you change whether you think it should be treated medically. So he ends up saying that whenever you call something, the best definition of disease people can find is something like that something functions, something has changed in a way such that it's lost its functionality relative to average functionality for a class, right? So you take your average, you look at the functionality of the average, you say, okay, something's happened, so it's dropped far below average. And then he points out that the choice of class is actually not objectively fixed and depending on value. So you can run the same stuff again. So I say, are your knees healthy? What's your class? Is it all humans? Is it male humans? Is it male humans in their 20s and 30s? Is it wealthy male humans? Is it athletes? Is it high performance athletes, right? Each of those choices of a class is going to change what counts as the average and change what counts as healthy. And there's not, he says, an objectively correct way to determine the class. And so does it make sense? These are cases where some really sneaky, where a lot of the cases that I've ended up looking at for something like a metric, what it looks like is it's objective at every stage. It looks objective. It looks value neutral at every stage. And there's one tiny point where suddenly this massive, autonomous, value-laden decision enters. And what a lot of the philosophers of science end up saying is that's a case where that's how basically, like, that's how you launder political and value decisions and make them look objective. So there's really interesting. Sorry, I just want to throw examples at you for us to talk about. You might find David Danks and Sina Fazilpour. Do you know them? They're AI ethics people.
I don't, though.
You should talk to them. They are amazing. So in some sense, I'm kind of a bullshitter here because I know a lot about the history and politics of data, and I know nothing about AI. These two are AI specialists. Them and Katie Creel are like people that actually know machine learning and actually know the stuff I'm going to talk about. They're specialists. You should talk to them. So Fazilpour and Danks end up talking about all these places in ML and AI where they think there's the entrance of some sneaky political value choice that gets disguised in the process and kind of laundered out of the entire process. So their case study is a set of student success prediction models that got trained on student success data, and almost every step looks very, very, very objective, very fair. And then they point out that at some point, in order to train the model, they needed to operationalize the notion of student success. And then their question was, who got to specify what counted as student success that the model got trained on? And they point out it was just administrators. So what the models got trained on as the definition of student success was graduation rate, graduation speed, right? They cared deeply about dropout rate. So I do this stuff. I actually ended up teaching this stuff in a algorithmic fairness class, and the students were like, well, that seems fine. And I'm like, okay, name things that you might have cared about college that aren't on this list. And I mean, it takes you like, social connections. I mean, work connections, happiness, like all that stuff drops out. And you might have gotten a very different result if you'd asked teachers or advisors or students, God help you. You might have gotten a very different notion of student success if you'd asked students. But does that make sense? So there's this whole system where every step is okay. I'm going to tell you. I'll tell you one more thing, and I can see you reacting to some of this stuff. So I can see that you're by this stuff. But there's an example way back from the beginning of the history of this stuff. So Mary Poovey, she has a book called The History of the Modern Fact. She is a science and technology studies scholar. And she has this notion, she's interested in this notion of this modern notion of a fact. And she says, what counts as a fact, what a piece of trustworthy evidence, changes radically somewhere around the Middle Ages. So before that, what was to be a fact, what was to be trustworthy, was to come from a trustworthy person. You trusted the fact because you trusted the person. And what we have now is a notion that what makes something good as a fact that it's neutral. It doesn't come from a particular person, but it comes from a kind of neutral, objective system that's gotten rid of everything personal. And most people, when they think about this, they probably think it originates with the early sciences. And she ends up saying it actually originates about 100 years earlier with the origination of double entry bookkeeping as an accounting system in 16th century Italy. And then she finds the early scientists like Bacon being like, oh my God, these accountants have really figured out a good way to do things. We should imitate them. And she points out this really incredible thing. So she says, what double entry bookkeeping was, it was a system where the rules were so precise that anyone could enter things into the bookkeeping system, and the manipulations were completely transparent. Anyone could follow them. And so you didn't have to trust a person, right? You just have to trust the system, because the system is something that is completely legible, it's completely clear. But she points out the entire system, so there's a whole system of arithmetically clear manipulations of the values of things in an accounts book that is completely legible except for one thing. The initial valuation of the objects when you enter them into the account book, when you originally say like, I have all these cows, they're worth this much money, there are no rules for that, right? So what she ends up pointing out is this system gets us an enormous amount of trust because all the manipulations are completely mechanical and arithmetical after the starting point, and that makes people trust the system, even though the foundation of the system is on a completely unguarded, unspecified, unregulated, just like cost entry, right? Value entry. And a lot of the cases that I end up looking at have that quality where you have this enormous set of very clear mechanical operations, and then right hidden at the bottom is this choice of what counts as health, what's the average class for a disease, what's going to count as student success. And there's this incredible entrance of complex, contingent, potentially subjective, potentially autonomous values that sneak into the base of systems. Okay, that's done. That's my first rant.
This is great. I'm trying to figure out if I want to throw some examples back at you or what to. There's so much to go into and all of that. Related to some of the AI ethics work you mentioned, there's a lot of, I suppose, debate right now or thinking about when we are training large language models, for instance. How do you actually measure what's useful to them? And there's this kind of whole back and forth over, do we want to use these super large benchmarks, things like MMLU, that kind of give us this nice single number to compare models? Or a lot of people are interested in the idea of like vibes-based evaluations, which is that much more complicated. Let me actually interact with this thing and figure out, is it useful for the things I want it to be useful for? And of course, that's going to look different for different people. And it involves a lot of value judgments on the part of the user of the model. And so I think that relates quite a bit to the sorts of examples you were thinking about, importantly. And another one thing that kind of interests me across a lot of the examples you bring up is kind of trying to dive into the human psychological component of what's underlying our capacity to go into a lot of this. I think in one lecture you mentioned that there's a lot of sociological literature that notes this process of value collapse and how it happens, but that there's little psychological literature about it. And this is interesting to me too. But before I kind of like ask more about that, I'm curious if you have any hypotheses about why that is.
Oh, this is such an interesting question. So let's talk about this, and then I want to get back to this question about the AI benchmarks, because I am so interested in what you say about this, because again, I don't know a lot about AI, but I know a lot about benchmarks in other places. So I'll tell you what I'm thinking. So the starting point for this thought for me was when I was working on games, and there's a lot of research. People worry about video games, that video games will make people violent, and Most of the empirical literature says it doesn't because people know fantasy from reality, and video games don't make them violent in the same way that like TV shows don't seem to make people violent. I think there's another worry, which is so Jesper Juhl, who's this game studies scholar, has this great way of putting it. He has a book called Half Real. He says video games are half real. If I, for example, if we're in a first-person shooter and I headshot you, fictionally I've killed you. Really, I've gained a point on you and, advanced up the ranking, right? So my worry is that if fictionality is the screen, that might not apply to points. And if games prime us to do anything, they might prime us to expect clear quantitative value systems. So the slogan from the book is, I'm not worried that games will make serial killers. I'm worried that games will make Wall Street bankers, right? That you might come out of games and be like, okay, values are clear and ranked, so let me just find any ranking system and orient myself towards that. I mean, this is so I'm worried about that leakage. That's, by the way, not that's just a worry I have. There aren't any empirical results on it. I've talked maybe one psychologist to doing some stuff on it, but in general, if you look at the sociology literature, so people like Wendy Esplund and Michael Sauter in their book Engines of Anxiety, which is a 10-year careful empirical study of what happens when the U.S. News and World Report rankings, when the U.S. News and World Report starts ranking law schools, and the answer in all. So Sally Engel Mary, her book Seductions of Quantification. She's an anthropologist. A lot of the stuff is in Theodore Porter's Trust in Numbers, and there's this general. But he's a historian, so these aren't psychologists. But they all notice something like you get institutions, and they'll be tracking all this stuff, and then they'll generate some simple information compression thing that leaves out a lot of stuff. So for Wendy Esplund, and Michael Sauter, it's the U.S. News and World Report rankings. For Sally Engel Mary, it's the UN's Global Development Index, which is a simple ranking of how countries compare on human rights and development. For Theodore Porter, it's the cost-benefit analysis. And everyone knows when you make the system that it's leaving out an enormous amount of information and that it's a really simplified proxy, and then you put it there, and then the entire system orients towards it. Like all the people just start pursuing it. And what a lot of them point out, Esplund's really clear about this, is that when you get this ranking system, a lot of the times for the first 10 years the ranking system is out, everyone's like, well, the ranking system, it doesn't capture everything, but it's there, so we have to chase it. And then after 10 years, people just start presuming that that's what's valuable. So in my paper Value Capture, I got really interested in Esplund and Sauter's results. What they charted the fact that at the time the ranking system came out, once it came out, prospective law school students just seemed to assume that it was an objectively correct listing of what they should be doing. Not even an objectively correct gathering of what other people thought about the rankings, but just setting what every student should be pursuing. Like, so this was my case, that this is actually just like setting people's values for them. I think the slogan from this is that when you get value captured, you start outsourcing your values. You start outsourcing what your goals are to like the U.S. News and World Report or like Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting is the kind of sociology, anthropology literature is completely clear that they just see this happen over and over again. I've seen very little psychological literature on it. There's now a tiny bit. I've just seen this tiny literature on like, I think it's like bias towards explicit, some term like that. But there's now a tiny literature on this in the psych, but way less than I would think there should be given. I've also found this. So this is a little contested now. But there's this account so a philosopher of food, Megan Dean, pointed me this stuff on something called restraint theory, and apparently one of the going theories in the science of eating that explains why some people have this diet then binge cycle is something like, if you spend your time obsessed with externalities about nutrition, like the labeling, then you burn out your ability to feel your own sense of satiety. And so when you stop trying to when you give up a diet, suddenly you have no regulatory mechanisms and you binge. This is I mentioned this because there's a little bit of empirical. It's one of the places where there is this research on people just like hyper queuing on a quantity, but it turns out that that's now contested, and that literature is now I can't get clear results out of that literature. But yeah, there's not a lot of psych research about what the mechanisms are. The closest I've
Yeah, and I'm really curious, like, why you think that is.
I mean, okay, there's a bit of psych stuff that I think might apply. So there's this cognitive bias literature on legibility, like the easier something. So the easier something of the process, we're biased in favor of believing it. So there's this research about how like if things are in a clearer font, um, then people are more likely to believe it. What I actually think is kind of more existential, and I'm not sure you get an empirical result on it. I think that like life is miserably confusing, and we're overloaded with all these complex decisions about complex values, plural values, unclear applications of what we care about. And for me, one of the appeals of games is that in a game, you get a relief from that sense of complexity. You don't have to make these complex trade-offs between like the value of family and the value of your research and the value of your health. You just, right? The game just says, here's how you make points. And you're like, okay, right? Complex judgment calls and painful trade-offs are gone in the value space. And I think that's very seductive. And if you let yourself be value captured, if you stop worrying about there being a million different deep variables, deeply different values that you have to trade off against that are hard to apply and that change between people, and you give yourself the illusion that there's some singular, simple, countable value, then life feels a lot easier. There's also another thing I'm trying to work out is here's another potential argument. This is a social argument, not a psychological argument. Um, if there's a kind of justification that we don't share, if each of us has a personal justification, and there's another kind of justification that we all share, then when you're trying to get things done in the world, the shared justification is going to have more social power, and so it'll tend to win out. And so you should. This is me chewing on stuff I learned from Theodore Porter, the trust in numbers guy, but uh, there's a super simple mechanism here where you might think that clarity and communicability will get you more social power, and so social institutions will tend to move in the direction of clearer and simpler values, even if that doesn't capture a lot of what we actually care about.
So I guess kind of jumping back maybe to right before this example where, you articulate games as this kind of existential balm from life, I think is the terminology you use, which I really like. And in kind of search of that clarity within a single human, one thing that I'm chewing on and that I've been chewing on as I read your stuff is the way in which I wonder how much this is related, or if it's at all related to this artifact of what goes on at a deeper level as we just examine and understand the world around us. So there's this really interesting essay that Simon Blackburn has on Hume. I think he's kind of trying to take Hume, sort of the classic induction problems, all the things like this, and fit it within his own quasi-realist framework. And the way he talks about Hume is that there's this almost two-way process of how we develop the concept of thick connections between events, where we observe, event A and then event B and then event A and event B. And you're an empiricist, you don't observe like the causal arrow between A and B. And so Hume is like, we can't really believe in this. But we end up kind of inferring from that. The world kind of gives us something with which to operate. And then we, in turn, the second step of this is we take that framework we developed and then we impose it on the world that we're looking at. And we interpret everything else through that lens. And that felt like almost like a general version of many of the examples we deal with here. And maybe not exactly the same thing when it comes to legibility, but that there is like a type of legibility there where I'm reading off the world presents me with something that might in fact be a thin connection, and to make sense of what's going on, to act practically. And a lot of your examples have to do with things that we have to do. We have to reduce the complexity of the world in order to act practically. So one thing I've been chewing on this week, particularly, I guess, as I was reading that essay after reading a bunch of your stuff, is kind of how those things relate.
This is such a good question, and you have your finger on the pulse. I was just talking to Joyce Havsed, a philosopher of science colleague of mine, about this stuff. And I do think the root of a lot of this is Hume. Like, Hume saw this stuff. So let me throw a bunch of things at you that I think are actually all related, and then I'll try to trace them all back to this central thing about Hume. So I think so there's this general theme. Okay. A way I've been thinking a lot is one of the central features of our experience of the world is the world is too big for any individual. So the philosopher Elijah Milgram was the person that like revolutionized me philosophically. He has this book called The Great Endarkenment, and he puts it as like the core knowledge problem of our era is that all knowledge is scattered across these hyper specialized domains, and then you have to stitch these arguments between domains, but no one actually understands the whole argument. And so you get these accumulation errors, right? Like where people have to use statistics and physics and all these results from other fields, and they can use the simplified tool that they've been given, but they don't understand the full science because no one can understand everything, right? So what do we do about the fact the world is too much? So I think one easy way into this is just thinking about our relationship to heuristics. So one of the things that people who think a lot, both in philosophy and in cog-sci, think about is we can't actually make decisions keeping track of every single feature in the world, right? So we often have to come up with these simplified decision procedures that just key off of a few simple things in the world. So when I used to eat like crap, and I tried to improve my eating by optimizing every nutrition in every bite, I couldn't do it. It was exhausting. And then I picked up a heuristic, and the heuristic was just like, don't eat processed food, right? Super simple, super easy, super followable, imperfect, usable as an action procedure. So that's a heuristic. Of course, that heuristic is gameable. In fact, that heuristic no longer works because I think the world of the world of food corporations figured out that people were using something like this heuristic, and they've learned to make like basically addictive crap that also qualifies as unprocessed.
Exactly.
Because they know exactly what the regulatory labels are. And so now you have crap that's labeled unprocessed. So that heuristic no longer works, but it worked for a while. So the two general lessons are: one, limited beings in order to act need simple heuristics. And two, heuristics will always go wrong. And so we need to be open to shifting our heuristics when we have evidence that the world has shifted. William Wimsatt, philosopher of science, puts it like this. He says, the way that we operate is we need to have heuristics and then have a system of error metabolism. We have to be able to see the errors but systematically capture errors and use them to modify the heuristic. And one way I've been thinking about what I'm worried about is not you shouldn't use heuristics because we have to use heuristics. It's that I'm worried about systems, especially institutional systems, that kill the error metabolism part, that set a heuristic, rigidify it, and then don't give us a way of noticing that we've missed this. And I think this is particularly likely in the value space. So my worry, I'm writing a paper about this. I'm calling this worry value collapse. So the worry is something like if you define your core values too sharply and too minimally, then you lose your error metabolism because you will no longer have the means to notice that you're missing something. I mean, this is a super simple example is if you decide that all that matters is money and then you become an unhappy, miserable wretch, that won't count as a failure because You're still making money. But I mean, I'm sure you can think of other examples. I think you can spin this up to like if an educational institution focuses on student graduation rate and speed as their and specifies that as the only outcome they care about, they're not going to have the basis for seeing that they've gone wrong. So I'm particularly worried. Okay, that's one big long thing. So we'll get to Hume eventually. So the another way into this is thinking about the simplifications involved in institutional classification systems. So when I was trying to understand metrics and trying to understand what was missing from metrics, I ended up reading a bunch of stuff and starting to think that was actually really important was the system at the entry point for collecting data. And that's just, there's almost always a classification system at the entry point for any data collection effort. So the most useful thing I found in this long trawl was a book from Bowker and Starr, Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, called Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences. And it's kind of a social political history of classification systems. And one of the things they note is whenever you get a classification system in an institution, right? So first, data collection efforts are institutional efforts, or things that big sprawling organizations do, or networked organizations. In order for that to work, you need a classification system that's stable, right? If everyone comes up with their own race categories and collects different racial data, and there's no like mechanism to match up what people are collecting, then you're not going to be able to generate data. Let me let me go back and introduce one more concept. A lot of the stuff I'm drawing from is this field called science and technology studies, interdisciplinary field that I found really useful. And a lot of what Scott is doing is drawing on these sources. So a lot of the people I'm talking about are influences for Scott. So Theodore Porter, Trust in Numbers, is kind of the foundational text from this field. And he's interested in comparing quantitative and qualitative knowledge and trying to understand why quantitative knowledge has such political power in bureaucracies. And he's particularly interested in when people seize on quantified forms of justification, even when they know the metrics are bad, it works institutionally better. And here's his claim. He says, qualitative and quantitative ways of knowing are good at different things. Qualitative ways of knowing are rich and sensitive and open-ended and dynamic, and they can adapt, but they don't travel well across different contexts. People that don't share a lot of background information can't understand qualitative evaluations easily. Quantitative justification, and here's a asterisk. I only mean quantitative knowledge as occurs in institutions. I'm not talking about in principle math of the stars. We're just talking about human organizations. In quantitative knowledge institutions works like this. You identify some kind of context invariant kernel that is comprehensible to different people who share very little background. You agree on it, you stabilize it, and everyone collects into it. And now that information can travel and aggregate easily. Easiest example, qualitative evaluations like written evaluations of student work, like when I write, paragraphs to my philosophy students about the originality and depth and all that stuff. Like that's very rich, very useful, very responsive, does not travel well. Grades are the institutional quantified form of knowing, right? Everyone agrees approximately what an A means, what a B means. That means different people can quickly enter a form of data that can travel and be understood and then aggregate easily. So one way to put it is that to generate the powerful context crossing powers of institutional quantification, you have to strip away the kinds of information that require high sensitivity, high context, and high nuance. This is normally referred to as the portability theory of knowledge or the portability theory of data. What it is to be information or data in this sense, what is at the heart of quantification is the transformation of understanding so it can travel easily between contexts. And if this makes sense, exactly what makes it powerful is exactly the thing that also is its weakness, right? You have to remove the parts of context that aren't the parts of the information that aren't shared across contexts. So that's one part of the puzzle. Does that make sense? Does that kind of track? Okay, so the next part of the puzzle is Bowker and Starr's classification systems. So when you're generating this kind of data, a lot of the stability is ensured by a shared classification system. Um, so they spent a lot of time studying the ICD-10, the International Classification System for Disease, which is the basis for international mortality statistics, cause of death statistics, accident statistics. Again, if each country has totally different categories for what it captures information to, you can't aggregate them easily into the kind of worldwide statistics that you need to do epidemiology and various medical research. So there's a central manual. But that manual has to make decisions, right? It doesn't have. The point is that you can't capture an infinite number of different types of disease. You just settle on some finite number. And the process by which you settle on them, what they say is like a deeply political, deeply interested process. So they have a bunch of examples, but one of my favorites is just if you look at the codes for falls data, they have all kinds of. There's a lot of different codes for collecting data on falls in urban environments. There's different codes for fall down the stairs, fall from a bed, fall from a commode, right? Fall from playground equipment. And for falls in nature, all they have is fall from a cliff and fall other. So one way to put it is that here's how they put it. Whenever you set a category for information collection, that's a prior decision about what information to retain and what information to forget. So, for example, the US Census race categories retain the difference between Asian and Latino and forget the difference between South Asian and East Asian. That's a decision. What information you retain and forget comes out of an interest. And one of the things you can see from the falls data example is that represents the interest of urban people over rural people, right? And so this is another one of these examples of the hidden value latedness at the core of a vast information infrastructure. So, okay, so now getting back to Hume. So here's the idea. We see this overwhelmingly complicated world full of spectrums and shades of gray and different ways of being, and we could not cope with it. We need to simplify it in some way. Here's the suggestion. When we collect data, we institutionally decide on a simple set of categories, and then those categories inform the basic way that we collect data about the world and what we will miss in our data collection about the world. And one thought is, this is, I think, what a lot of the philosophers of science who are kind of inflected by Hume, people like Hasek Cheng and Nancy Cartwright will say. They'll say that this is all right if you are willing to shift your categories, right, when you get more and more information that the categories are insufficient. But what Bowker and Starr say is actually in institutions, the categories get hardened into the institution. They get built into the infrastructure. They get built into some core data set. And people don't muck with the categories because, among other things, if you change the basic categories in your data set, then different data sets are no longer compatible. You can't compile them easily. Okay, so does that make sense? That was all. Have I wandered too far off track, or are we tracking?
Not at all. Not at all. There's a lot of kind of ways to go from here, and one of the things you talk about kind of at the end of your hostile epistemology paper, I think relates to what you just said when it comes to the shifting of categories. Similarly, in our epistemic lives where we're kind of vulnerable to different sorts of manipulation, we never get to like a point where we just get to sit there, right? There's this kind of constant struggle to adapt, and it's the way you describe it, it's kind of Sisyphean almost, this epistemic arms race that we're locked into for the rest of our lives. And something very similar I read recently too was, I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Mullany and his history of the Chinese typewriter, but he does this fascinating work deconstructing the conceptual algorithm by which we understand what it is to be a typewriter, and why when you and I hear a phrase like Chinese typewriter, we deem this a literally impossible object. And this is all really an artifact of, as many of the examples you brought up also are, a historical process by which we came to a point of, well, here are the values that we have about what a typewriter should do. And these were mostly coming from Western nations. And so the Western nations who kind of had this dominance over the technology of a typewriter got to decide what a typewriter should look like, how it should be physically implemented, who it should serve, and then brought the rest of the world under that front. But the really interesting thing he said to me that I think relates to a lot of what you say as well is when he then names this conceptual algorithm by which we come to say the Chinese typewriter is impossible, that a typewriter has these specific features like what you type, a single key maps to a single letter or some basic unit of the ontology of the language you're dealing with, and what you press, is what you get, basically what you see on the screen. You can name that. You can deconstruct this algorithm, this thing that is embedded in our minds. But just naming and deconstructing once does not do the work of putting you outside the frame that you just existed in. You have to keep doing that work. You don't get to just say, I have deconstructed this problem for you, and we're now kind of above and outside of it. But that is something you have to keep doing. And I'm kind of curious how you think about that wrestle.
So, I mean, I think one way to summarize a lot of our conversation is something like this. I'm interested in the cases where something that looks objective from a lot of angles underneath has this hidden, deep value, social political contingency in it. A place where a lot of this locates is in, I mean, I hate this philosophy way of putting things, conceptual architecture, how we set up the categories. I mean, and the really easy way to put it is, the leading social edge of this is classification systems. If you want the easiest example of this, look at the history of the politics of the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. What counts as a mental disorder or a mental disease is the result of a really complicated set of fairly political wranglings, often about like when. So there's a history of when it is very mysterious when shopping addiction got a possible diagnostic category as there's a shift from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. Okay, whatever. So we have these conceptual borders that not only tangle up various forms of value. So one of the things that I think a lot of the examples we've had is the decision about what counts as health, about what counts as a disease, what counts as a disorder is a really value-laden decision. But one of the suggestions from Bowker and Starr is it's not, even if it's value neutral, the decision about where the category boundaries are decisions about where you lose data and where you keep it in the very opening act of data collection, right? And then I think your way of putting it is, you can realize that, and you can see the contingency, and then if you don't keep it forefront in your mind, you'll just forget it. The way that Bowker and Starr put it is that classification systems tend to get naturalized. They are particular decisions by a particular group of people, and then when they enter information infrastructure, we just start thinking, yeah, no, that's what nature is. There's just look, there's white people and black people and Asian people and Latino people. That's the real structure of the world. But I think Bowker and Starr add something to your thought, which is it's not just internal psychological inertia. When these categories get built into the physical architecture of data systems, right? Then they gather an enormous amount of inertia. And their examples are a lot like this. It's like, look, you might want to think of disease in a different way, but to get data about it, you would not only have to change the ICD-10, you'd have to get every single country's statistical collection office to change its forms and to change its spreadsheets. That's just a huge amount of drag, right? I mean, one way I put it to my students is look, there's an information collection system for me to use for students. And what it focuses on is grades and attendance. That's the information that I can enter into the system. And if I want to say something else, there's a space for it. There's a little memo space where I can add a memo. And I can add a memo this student their parents got long COVID, and they were doing really well, or like they didn't do well in the test, but they helped the community so much, and but their grade is lower than my respect for them. And that information goes nowhere, right? It enters into this little storage unit, but because it's not been prepared, because it's not in one of the standard data collection categories, it doesn't aggregate, right? So it's just gone. Like no one outside of me is going to see that piece of information. No recruiter, no law school person, right? The things that are legible at the institutional level are the things that can be aggregated into one of those core metrics, GPA, attendance statistics, things like that. Because the system has been readied for it, and the system has been readied for it by having a certain set of categories that are kind of stabilized across the system. Does that make sense? I mean, it's like, look, it's like to go back to Scott, what an institution sees it's not just random. It's what it's easy to collect data about, but what it's easy to collect data about is also not just kind of an objective feature of the world. It's things that we decided, and like the reason that it's easy for me to collect grades data, but not easy for me to like report information about students like integrity, right? That's because of a long-term set of institutional decisions that got made about how the database got structured, right? So I mean, a step beyond you could take from Scott that people like Blackburn and Starr have pushed on me is what's legible is not just a feature of the world. What's legible is something that we create by creating infrastructure and creating diagnostic manuals and creating classificatory codes. And we make those things, and they reflect the interests of the people that make them in a very deep and very obvious way. And then that kind of vanishes from sight the longer we use those classification systems.
Yeah. When I'm thinking about like the ways to approach this, I mean, a natural question that comes up at this point, and that I think you've gotten in a lot of talks as well, is the "what do we do about it" question. And I think that your responses to bring classification back, I guess I've roughly classified them into versions of here's a set of kind of principles by which we could understand this, and some of this kind of comes directly from your papers, where at some points it does make sense for us to impose simple values, but we have to be really careful about the places and situations in which those are actually useful for us. And we have to retain that ability to kind of step a level up and ask ourselves meta level questions about, okay, I've been in this gamified, you could call it, system where I've adopted really simple values and acted on them, but are those the values I actually want to have? And you have to retain that ability somehow. And sometimes your answer also just kind of looks like, I don't know, because it's hard. And I think that that's the answer a lot of us would have about these things. And I guess like more than a specific answer from you here about this, I'm curious about just like how you sit with that when it comes to, there's this aspect of a lot of what we've been talking about that is diagnosing issues here. And a lot of these issues are really hard. Some of them probably irresolvable in different ways, many of them historical artifacts, and a lot of them results of the structures of power that kind of exist. And so as somebody who is pointing out all of these problems and really doing a lot of work to try to specify and diagnose them, how you think about that theory of change aspect of your work?
So the question comes at two levels. One is kind of an individual, how do I cope as a person? And one is, what are the institutional fixes?
Yeah.
I have more answers on the individual level than the institutional level. I think because a lot of what I'm saying is that the logic of institutionality always pushes you in this direction. And I should emphasize what I said, what one of the things you mentioned, which is I don't think this stuff is bad. Like I feel like I'm busy pointing the downsides because the world is too obsessed with the upsides. But large scale data aggregation is what enables the sciences to work. Like I would be dead without modern science, and that works because of large scale data aggregation. Although I want to point out that large scale data aggregation is maybe one thing that I'm saying is it's better at getting at things that are more naturally standardized and non-variable, like how antibiotics work, and perhaps significantly less effective when the thing that you're targeting is highly variable, like a very variable internal conception of what well-being is for your life. Right? So on the individual level, the most romantic thing I have to say is that we have tendencies that we know the names of that are resistant to this kind of thing. The names for them are like aesthetics, beauty, play, and irony, right? All of these are the standard view of aesthetics is what it is to view things aesthetically, to approach things with an artistic attitude, is to not try to look at them through preset categories and search using clear mechanical principles, but kind of like to openly see the thing as it is. What it is to be playful, most of the standard accounts of what it is to be playful is to shift around and try on different perspectives and not get locked on to the clearest, right? But these are attitudinal things. So the next level thing is something like, and actually I've been writing about this more. So I'm not sure if you saw, for readers that are interested, if you want a written version of some of the basics of these ideas, I just published this piece called The Limits of Data for Issues of Science and Technology. And it's just kind of a summary, a hopefully useful reader's guide summary of a lot of this stuff. And I think one way to put it that's less like goofy and romantic is to remember to note both the usefulness of metrics, but also note their contingency and their information compression. I think there's a tendency to just to be like, well, I think the motto that I sometimes hear from some STEM folks is, if I can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And I think that's the thing where I'm like, no. Measurement is a very specific procedure that really picks up on certain things and is really not good at picking up on highly variable, highly internal, highly subtle qualities. I think one of the places this comes out for me is, well, no, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the second stage of things is, I think we have an easy way. There's a natural thought that's like, look, every tool is good at a certain thing and limited in other ways. And I think database methodologies are very powerful and also have a clear limitation. I think the limitation is clearest when you move to thinking about notions of value and measuring what's valuable, right? Because that's the place that's most likely to have high variance between people, high variance between local communities, high context sensitivity. And if you treat data as a tool that is very good at one thing, but also missing a lot of other stuff, I think but I feel like the world we're in is a world that tends away from that, to thinking like, look, like data is the thing that will capture everything, ignore your internal senses, right? On the institutional level, really answers for me are really hard. I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm thinking about suggests certain answers. Have a ton of metrics. Add qualitative methodology too. And a lot of the empirical work says whenever people try to do that, that just kind of washes out of the system. And institutions tend to focus people on a few clear standard metrics. And the reason seems to be that the functioning of having a few clear sample metrics is precisely that it makes communication easier. It makes it easier for people to coordinate at scale, right? So it's really like, I don't know a good institutional solution. Like, I fight with this all the time with myself in my class design, because I always have to decide how the grading is going to go, and I'm constantly worried that excess emphasis on grading is just going to play into this mindset of everyone orienting towards a simple measure. But I also know that we're in the world such that, basically the simple version is, when I de-emphasize grading in my upper level seminars by people who already care about philosophy or game design, that's fine. But when I de-emphasize grading in my intro classes, stop coming, and they don't learn anything. And that's because the rest of the world is hyper focused on grades already. And I feel like, I mean, if I had a better answer for you, I would know what to do about my grading, but I don't. Like, I feel like I'm just caught.
It's difficult, yeah. At the individual level, what you're saying does really strike. And I think in a lot of your papers, like Art as a Shelter from Science and Autonomy and Aesthetic Engagement, you kind of get to the point that there's this inversion. And I guess it's a little bit, there's like a relation to the kind of striving play you talk about when it comes to games, but we're really engaging in something that is like we understand that it's complex. We are disappointed when we understand something too quickly. We want that complexity to exist when we engage in these aesthetic pursuits. And like we also want to do things for ourselves and like engage in that understanding of or coming to a conclusion about a movie. And that is less about being right, for example, you kind of talk about. Well, we want to come to something that is broadly right, but to you it's more about like that individual kind of personal relationship we have with actually getting to engage with the work. Whereas in other cases like science, we're prepared to defer to expert judgment and things like this, because again, we are finite beings who can't understand the whole world around us. And what matters is these perhaps value laden things like metrics, places where we really come to that conclusion. And so at an institutional level, hard. At an individual level, I guess it is like we can come to this point of being able to balance understanding that in certain domains of life or at certain times it's appropriate to adopt these gamified value laden things, and they can be good for really useful purposes, but then like remembering to engage with those more aesthetic parts of life.
Yeah, I mean, one way to put it is, so I think, I mean, I don't want to summarize it like three other papers, but basically, I think a lot of our life with art is a game, and it's a game because we've added rules. And in general, I think we build games and we create rules because we like the kind of activity of acting under those rules. There's this basic insight from Bernard Suits, this philosopher of games I love, that when you're running a marathon, it's not the most efficient way to do it. You could get to that finish line faster by taking a shortcut or a bicycle or an Uber, right? If you're doing it because there's something valuable about doing it in a particular way. I think a lot of our life is with art is like this. We avoid referring to experts, which would get us more accurate opinions. We avoid just like, um, I mean, here's I think the worst way to approach a life with art. Don't watch movies. Just make judgments based on Rotten Tomatoes, because that's right. There's the clear objective data, right? Like the point, we built this life with art in particular to practice thinking and feeling for ourselves and deciding what matters for ourselves, and not having an external metric force a value on us. So I think there's a certain way in which our life with art has been built to practice this. Oh my god! Can I tell you the big new idea that I've been working with?
Please.
Okay, so I've been really interested in trying to understand the difference between games and metrics. Right, like there's a sense in which games share a lot of the qualities of metrics. There's a ranking, there's a point system. Often there's a very clear way of advancing, right? And a lot of the stuff I've been saying is like, oh, metrics tend to get our values wrong. It's really worrisome. And games are different. And I think so. There's a lot of explanations for why games are different. They're temporary. They're not all inclusive and immersive like GPA. You take them on for a moment of time. But I think there's this thing. Okay, the practice of playing games for fun looks like this to me. You enter into a scoring system, you take it on all the way, someone tells you what to chase and you chase, and then you step back from that scoring system and you ask yourself whether it was valuable to you, and then you use your own sense of value. Does that make sense? Like what you do when you play a game is you take on a scoring system and then you step back and you say, was that worth it? Was that fun? Was that enjoyable? Right? What I want to say is, this makes sense. You're exerting reflective control over the scoring systems you're using, instead of in the rest of life where life hands you a scoring system and you kind of have to like bend to GPA or grant funding or outcomes. So one way of putting it, and I think this is going to steer us back towards Scott. So this might get us a good arc. Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about the philosophy of technology. Langdon Winner has this great piece called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" Do you know this piece?
I don't.
Yeah. I think you'd really like it. It has the same kind of vibe as a lot of the stuff we're talking about, which is, oh, people normally kind of assume that technologies and artifacts are value neutral, and it's just the people that use them that impose a value or use them to political ends. And Winner thinks, no, a lot of the times a technology, the way it is, kind of pushes or drags the world into a political, social, or political structure. So, but it's like subtle. It's not like, oh, there are liberal technologies and conservative technologies. It's more like this. So, think about the technology of oral communication. When most of news transmission happened orally, that was a deeply decentralized communication technology, right? Lots of different people have power to alter the news, and lots of different people have power to add things that kind of get mixed in with the news. Does that make sense? Like if I say something to you, then and I add my opinion or my commentary or I give my rendition, that's what passes. Printing presses change everything. Printing presses radically centralize control over communication and distribution of information, right? Like you need the basic fact about printing presses is they're kind of big and kind of expensive. And when they print things, those things are different in status than speech, right? So now if I have a newspaper and I give it to you and I'm like, check out this news, and I give you a verbal comment, that doesn't get mixed into the newspaper. Does that make sense? So the newspaper is stabilized and it transfers. Does this make sense? Newspapers power that centralize power over information and information distribution. And then things change again. Ham radio is deeply decentralized because it's cheap. Broadcast television is deeply centralized. And then Twitter and social media are super interesting because I think most people think that they're decentralizing technologies because everyone can have them. But uh, Zeynep Tufekci, who's this incredible media scholar, she's this great piece in Wired called, uh, what is it? Like, it's the golden democracy destroying age of free speech. What she ends up saying is,
I think I've read this one.
yeah, it's really good. And I think the most interesting point from it is that social media technologies look decentralized, but they're actually centralized because of the search algorithm. Everyone can create content, but the ability to like find content all gets centralized through search, right? If your stuff doesn't pop high in search, no one's going to see it. Actually, like, so there's a lot of empirical research that seems to show that like now people attend to fewer, the world as a whole reads far fewer things, and they all read the same things because of search. So does that make sense? So there's this like these different technologies that encourage. It's not like you take up the technology and it turns the world like fascist or something, but they push the world in a certain direction by centralizing or decentralizing things. So he also ends up talking about a lot about factories. He says that the technology of the factory is one that really encourages standardization, and so really lends itself and gives power to places with a centralized authority, right? So if you have a bunch of different shoemakers who are making their own shoes, they can each make different shoes, and they make different shoes each time. And if the technology of the factory says, no, you can make way more shoes and be way more efficient if each of you makes the same thing all the time. And that requires some kind of central authority to specify what those standards are and kind of enforce them. So, I mean, this is interesting. Like, maybe this is kind of a creepy way to say it, but factories invite the world to be a little more authoritarian because if you enforce a standard, you get a lot more efficiency, right? Okay. So I think here's one way to put it. I think metrics are a technology that centralizes the process of valuing. It makes it easier to create in a central space a value system, a way of evaluating things, and push that out. And it gives an enormous advantage to people that are willing to buy into it, an enormous advantage of coordination. Games are a technology that decentralizes value determination because the fact that games are so varied encourages us to try on different value systems and then pick the ones that suit us. Maybe that's too romantic, but does that make sense? Like, there's this the fact that metrics have to be, the fact that what makes metrics powerful is that they're coordinated at scale tends towards centralization of the valuing procedure. Games, even though they have these tight, rigid mechanisms, I think one of the core features of the world of games is the point systems don't need to interoperate and they don't need to be cross-compatible, right? And so you can just design completely different game scoring systems without the need to make them interoperate. Everyone has to use GPA in America, right? That system has to interoperate. And so there's an ecosystem that decentralizes the process of valuing and choosing which activities. So, I mean, I think this is the Scott story told about values, right?
There's like a self-reinforcement with metrics. I was asking you earlier about why you think there's a lot more sociological empirical observation when it comes to value collapse versus psychological. And I think I'm kind of starting to see it here. Like when you centralize the process of valuing according to metrics and everybody can just, as you put it, get their values off the shelf. And it's a lot easier to kind of inherit things in that sense. When you adopt those metrics and you do things, those metrics are useful insofar as you have adopted those metrics, right? You're like aligning yourself to those metrics, and then when everybody exists in that framework, then it has its utility. Then you're able to measure yourself against other people. And so you could imagine exiting from that completely, because somebody who again does not adopt those metrics, does not have that exact same value system as everybody else, is going to be like, okay, well, what the hell are you doing? Why would you do this? And culturally, I kind of see this happening to an extent, which is really interesting to me. But just thinking about that, yeah, I guess you talk about echo chambers a lot too, and there's like an echo chamberiness to it. Except the echo chamber is like the entire world because we've all adopted certain metrics in certain ways.
I think I love the way you put it. I just want to add one little asterisk, which is when you go on, I mean, sometimes I think of large scale metrics as like standardized value currency. Like when you go on the, the standard value system, doing it will have much more utility, but partially because you redefined utility. Right? So, but I do think there's a seductive effect that's like, look, if you accept the worldview in which all that matters is the things that are valuable by metrics, then things look awesome, right? You're part of this unified world where we're all making progress to hit these things that are easily measurable. We can see our progress and we're working together. But all that requires is that you give up the things that you originally cared about and simplify the things you value to match the metric. The other side, the other possibility is having values that suit you, but often finding it hard to express and having a difficulty coordinating towards those values. Now you might think, I think there's a certain kind of economic rationality here that's like, well, it doesn't really matter what you value, so why not value the thing? It's just like preference formation. So why not just prefer things that are easy to hit by coordinating with other people? The answer is going to have to be a pretty robust answer that has to do with a fairly robust notion of well-being. And there are two things to talk about. Do you know the literature about adaptive preferences?
It sounds familiar. I wouldn't say that I've read much of it, though.
This is incredibly interesting literature that I wish more people knew about. It comes out of, in some sense, it comes out of a lot of 80s feminist philosophical and feminist ethics criticisms of standard economic and rational choice theory that presumes that, look, well-being is just fulfilling people's expressed preferences. So one of the things a lot of people noticed. So early figures in this include, oh my god, I can't remember. I'll find it for you later. So the idea is something like, look, imagine a world in which only men are allowed to work and women are not allowed to work. One of the things we find from the psychological literature is that in those cases, if you're not allowed to work, people often adapt their preferences to meet what's available to them. So typically in that world, you'll find women adapting their preferences to housework, because it just hurts to have preferences that you can never satisfy because the world's against them. And so now it looks like you have a radically unjust world that perfectly satisfies everyone's preferences, because people's preferences shift to what's available to them. So the answer to most of these people in the space is that there has to be some notion of human well-being or flourishing that's bigger than just satisfaction of your expressed preferences. Um, and I think so the way I often think about it is through more work from Elijah Milgram. He has this book called Practical Induction and a paper that I love called On Being Bored Out of One's Mind. He ends up saying, look, your values need to fit you. Like, not all values work for everybody. And the way you find out if your values fit you is you live life with them and you find out how it goes. And a lot of that is in whether you are interested and engaged with life or whether you're depressed and bored. And if you're depressed and bored, that's feedback that the value system you have right now doesn't fit you. And so you should change it. And what changing it looks like is changing your job and changing your hobbies, right? Like friends of mine who were miserable in philosophy grad school, where the cultural goal that they had adopted was figure things out and publish things. And then they quit. And one of my best friends became a social worker. And now she's happy. And part of that happiness involves taking radically different goals and value systems that sort of loosely come packaged with this role, right? But that involves, and I think a lot of this happens when you change hobbies, or I tried running for a while and I was miserable and I shifted to rock climbing. And what that is shifting my goals and values, in some small part of my life, right? Some of these things leave me bored. Some of these things leave me engaged. So if he's right that what values are good for you have to be adapted to your particular circumstances and your particular personality, then the worst thing that could happen is that your values would be pushed down from some distant institutional source and those values would not be finally adapted to you or your context, but would be adapted to the institutional interests and the functionings of large-scale information communication. And I think that's for me, that's a Scott story as told towards value. That's a story of a central authority sacrificing the goods of local control and local sensitivity and expertise for local conditions and forcing out a simplified, regimented set of rules, standards, goals, and targets that work well for central organization, but don't work well for the individuals on the ground. That's the story. There's a Scott story of human values for you.
This really highlights why I continue to struggle with certain notions like progress studies and the way progress gets articulated in technology, because it's like this massive overarching term. Obviously, we know what progress means. It means more advanced technology, but what does that technology look like? Does it inevitably advance in the way people say it's going to advance? There's a lot of AGI millenarianism that goes on.
The thought of this field is very unsettling to me.
Yeah. It's unsettling to me too. And I don't know the way out of it, because so much of the field, I don't know about so much of the field, but there do seem to be a lot of people who are not reflexively critical about engaging in this way, and are people are going to advance this technology anyway. It's going to look something like what I imagine it's going to look like in the future. If I don't do it, somebody else will. All these justifications. And some of them are kind of right, but there's a lot that they miss. And I think a lot of what you said relates to a lot of what they miss. And I think that there's still that working out of the questions of, do we want certain technologies to exist? But I feel like very few people are willing to ask the should X technology exist question, because there's that embedded assumption of, well, if this technology can exist, then eventually it will exist. And because humans are humans, there's a truth to it. But I still have a lot of trouble with the modes of justification that go around with all of this.
Yeah, the thing that leaps out to me is the presumption that what progress is there's just a lot of different measures of progress. I think progress involves movement towards more social equity, better distribution of resources, more happier people, right? That's That's a very different metric. That's a different goal than increased technology. But I think, again, all of these worlds have this quality where if you simplify the goal enough, then you don't have to go through the messy process of arguing about what should be and what the values are. I mean, so let me try this on you. This is I'm writing a popular book about this stuff, and so I'm I'm trying various slogans and views. By the way, was the centralization and decentralization of value, is that interesting to you? Is that clear? Or
Yes, yeah.
that's a motto I came up with like last week. So this is like I'm just trying on
I like it.
different possible endings to this book. Um, so one way I think of it is like mechanical scoring systems, especially when they're mechanical. That is, there's these clear mechanical procedures for inputting things and processing things. They're a technology that's really good at converging people's judgments and settling the matter. So you don't have to worry about it anymore. You don't have to revisit anything. You can just get a clear sense that you've made progress. And they offer this trade-off. And the trade-off is if you acquire a mechanical scoring system, I think I've said a version of this before, then what you get is you get rid of disagreement, you get rid of variable judgment about whether things are good or bad, you get a quick route to settle opinions about whether we succeeded or not, and all you have to do is change your values such that they're shared and sufficiently simple that they're mechanically executable at scale. That's the only price.
And I guess the further question then is, again, I guess we said this a few times, but when are you willing to pay that price, and how much are you willing to pay it, and can you actually step back out of it?
I mean, okay, I will give you a few parting visions. So there are cases where I totally believe it's worthwhile to have a clear, simple target that everyone shares. Reducing CO2 emissions. Fuck yeah. Let us target that shit. Go all out for it. It's right. But not everything is like that. Not everything is that simple. So one of the things I think is it's good to maintain values at different scales. I think it's there's some kinds of things like CO2 emissions that targeting collectively makes sense, and there are other things like the what job you should take or what your hobbies are that I think are good when they're very decoupled from scale. And the worry is that we get pushed. There's this tendency to push up the scale and settle on the values that are comprehensible at larger scale. But right, um, so yeah, it's just a trade off, and I think like okay, I I've really shifted in these views. I think when I started this stuff, I was just like, metrics are bad, all this stuff is crap. And now I've gotten much more to these trade-off views. So did I send you my paper, Transparency is Surveillance?
I don't think so.
Okay. This is probably the clearest place I've come to the trade-off view. And so I'm looking at like here, it's a case study in some of this value capture stuff. It's a case study in transparency metrics, public transparency metrics. And I found this comment on it from the philosopher Onara O'Neill. And what she said was, people think transparency encourages trust, but transparency and trust are actually in tension because transparency asks experts to explain themselves to non-experts. But expert reasoning is, by definition, non-comprehensible to non-experts. And so she says experts are going to have to lie. And what I end up saying is actually it'll be even worse with value capture if experts often will avoid certain kinds of activities because they are not justifiable to non-experts. And so it's actually going to undermine their ability to act from expertise. Um, and so I end up saying like, but it's not like transparency is bad, right? Here's the basic problem. Transparency demands people explain themselves in a publicly comprehensible way. And this simultaneously gets rid of corruption, gets rid of bias, and gets rid of expert sensitivity. And there's not an answer for where you should be. It's just a trade-off. And I guess like all I can say is know you're making that trade-off. And I think the advanced version of this is mechanical scoring system. Like, so data systems are a trade-off between scalability and aggregability and context sensitivity. And then scoring systems are a trade-off between using that aggregability to get quick, coordinated, decisive evaluation and then being able to have your own fucking values. It's the trade.
That's yeah, I think probably that good note to end on is, I think towards the end of, I want to say, your value capture paper, you say we should want value federalism. And I think that's basically the summary word for a lot of what you're saying, that some values make sense to pursue at these large scale levels. At some smaller community levels, we might want other values, some values we want to figure out individually. And I know we didn't talk a lot explicitly about AI in this interview, and I think that's fine, but I think that this is something very important for the AI community as well. And I don't necessarily need to end every interview saying something about that, but I do think it's very importantly relevant for people doing that kind of research. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time today. I mean, I really love your work. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, as always, for listening, and thank you to my guest, Christopher Thi Nguyen. If you enjoyed this and would consider spreading the word, it'd help me out a lot, and I'll see you in the next episode.